Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Covenant Cast, where we discuss the past, present, and future of the tabletop gaming industry. I'm Zach.
And I'm Steven, and we have another entry into the How to Run a Game series. It's the Power 7, the 7 mechanics that are problematic, potentially, in games. Lukas Litzsinger is here with us today, lead designer best known for Android Netrunner, the reboot of a classic that was extremely well received. Also, of course, Star Wars Destiny, one of Zach's great loves in tabletop games, and now working for Wizards of the Coast on a game called Spell Slingers, a digital trading card game. And we're talking to Lukas about recursion, something that he knows a lot about. And obviously, if you've played games over the years, whenever the opponent starts looking through the discard pile and recurring the things that you thought you were done with, it can get really, really nasty. So we hope you'll stay tuned. All right, we are here with a longtime friend and one of the great designers of our time, Lukas Litzsinger. Lukas, it's great to have you here. Great to finally talk to you again in so long. It's been many years at this point, right?
It has been. Good to see you, Steven and Zach. I feel like time is a construct, and the pandemic has proven that years can pass, and it feels like only a couple of days sometimes.
Yeah, pretty wild. I'd be curious. I know a lot of people listening, we're kind of in just a totally different era than even a couple years ago, I think. Just obviously mentioned the pandemic and stuff, but can you give us a quick recap of who you are and kind of your path through tabletop as a designer and in the industry, just to give some context to why your opinions on things like recursion are relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Lukas Litzsinger, and I started at Fantasy Flight Games back in 2011. I was the lead designer on Android Netrunner for a few years. I also worked on Warhammer Invasion, Lord of the Rings, the card game, kind of touched a lot of the different living card games, and then was also the lead designer on Star Wars Destiny, which was Fantasy Flight's big foray back into collectible games. In addition to that, I worked on many other projects, board games, like the Civilization board game, also other games that were kind of, you could say, card game adjacent, like Warhammer Discourse, but worked on a lot of different projects. XCOM, the board game, was, man, that was a fun time as well. One of the first app-enabled board games, but worked on a long list of projects at Fantasy Flight. And then a couple of years ago, I left Fantasy Flight and I'm now at Wizards of the Coast. I've been working on a mobile title called Spell Slingers, where we're kind of trying to give you the best Magic experience built from the ground up for the phone. So hopefully sometime in the near future, you'll see it in an app store near you. If you're in Canada right now, you can go download it. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, you can go download it. So check it out. But I've been here for the past couple of years, and really, like, card games are kind of the thing that got me into the hobby as a job. I grew up playing them. I loved them. Never thought I'd be able to work on them. And here I am, I guess a couple decades later from slinging my first cards. And it's been a hell of a ride.
So let me paint a picture, and you guys feel free to step in here on the story.
I have a feeling I know exactly where this is going, but I can't wait.
It gets you to where we are now. It's a fateful conversation between Lukas and I think you and I, and it may have been at that panel at the Star Wars Destiny.
I think.
Was it before?
Are you referring to the?
Yes, the moment. Yeah, the moment. Yeah.
So
you've got a better memory, so you get
actually,
into it.
What happened is, so Star Wars Destiny had been announced.
Yeah.
Star Wars game, collectible. I had my reservations at first, and then after playing a couple games, immediately fell in love. Incredible game, one of my favorites of all time still. But one of the things we were doing leading up to the release is you were actually interviewing Lukas over like text.
Oh, right. Like, so it was like a written interview. Yeah.
Here's the written interview, and Lukas is going to reply back. So I'll let you take it back over. You prompted him with a series of questions, and that blog is, I think, still on our website.
Yeah. So the main question that brings us to today is, what is a lesson that you learned from Android Netrunner that you're going to take with you into the design of Star Wars Destiny?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was resounding, like kind of a loud and clear recursion. Watch out. Because like people recurring parasites from their graveyard, their discard pile, they're putting them on ice, they're destroying everything. It really breaks the fundamental balance of a game whenever you have ready access to a pile of cards that you can get at your, at your beck and call, as it were. And so we're like, oh, great. Luke is really growing as a designer, really an evolutionary process. And so
his grin right now, just getting queued up to get dunked on by Steven.
We thought,
my
gosh, Star Wars Destiny is going to be flawless, given all of these lessons that Lukas has learned here.
I mean, surely this was going to be the perfect game.
And then set 1 happened for Star Wars Destiny, which was a phenomenal set. We had a great time with set 1 of Star Wars Destiny. And you were more of a competitive player than I was. So was there anything notable about that set you think that is worth mentioning, or even the second or third set maybe?
I mean, there's a lot of things notable. It was a great experience. Had a lot of fun with it. But particularly, I remember the first set, one of the key interactions was the Millennium Falcon hyperspace combo, where you could essentially recur, the proper word for that, from your discard pile, a turn-ending card over and over, round after round, which was surprising given the response to the one thing that Lukas had identified was recursion. So
you're saying in the first set there was a broken recursion combo.
Well, broken is a matter of perspective.
Broken is a little bit of a strong word, but let's just say it was a negative play experience.
Yeah. So really, we are joking around because it was just such a hilarious
Lukas,
how did this happen? But I would be curious, to hear a little more about that story from your end, Lukas, because you seemed very set on not having recursion be a big part of that game, and then it kind of was a problem for a minute. So, how'd that happen? And then also, what was further learned in that moment? I guess what's the Lukas side of the story? We hear this side a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I think you're always, whenever you're designing a game, you're always under competing pressures. And so like recursion is one of those things where you should go into it with like big flashing red warning signs all over the place. I definitely believe that. And obviously I've learned my lesson multiple times at this point. But you're also trying to make sure that the game has a lot of texture and interesting interactions, and you're trying to keep the rules as clean and simple as straightforward as possible. And honestly, like, I feel like we knew like recursion and, hyperspace jump was a potential. We didn't think it would be quite as frustrating to play against as it was. But at that point, I felt like it was better to have the rules not have this like remove from game, or as Magic calls it, an exile zone. I wanted to keep it as like clean and as straightforward as possible, because we're trying to create a card game for Star Wars fans. We're trying to create a card game for a wider audience. And I felt like that was pretty technical, and also like it just makes the cards look a lot more complicated. So I'm like, well, maybe we can do without this zone. And spoiler alert, you really can't if you want to have some amount of recursion in your game. You probably should have some sort of remove from game zone, some sort of exile zone. I think, if you are going to build a card game from the ground up, just go ahead and put it in. I think it's part of the cost of doing business in most cases. But that was kind of what it came down to. It's like, we didn't think it would be as powerful as it was. And, unfortunately, we were wrong. And then also we were trying to keep the cards and the rules as simple and straightforward as possible. Like, you open up a starter deck in that game, and it's like the actual rules are on like 2 sheets, 1 sheet of paper, double-sided. So it's like just 2 pages. And we worked really hard to try to keep them to those 2 pages and give you everything you needed to know to play the game. Because I remember back when I started playing card games, they'd have these little rule books that were like 2 inches by 4 inches, almost like a little card, and it would have like 50 pages of 8-point text in there, and you're just kind of like going through and trying to learn everything you can about the game. And so like my vision for Star Wars Destiny was like, there are going to be kids out there who like, this is the first card game they play. I want them to love card games. And so I want to give them the best experience possible. I want them to be able to open up these starter decks and actually play the game and not worry about like all of the rules that we couldn't tell them. So that was kind of where that decision to not have, maybe some more safeguards in place for that particular combo came. And then, ultimately we decided to make some changes and prevent you from looping the hyperspace jump over and over again, unfortunately.
Incredibly thematic, by the way.
Yeah, very nice. It's always the Falcon, right?
Yeah.
It's always the Falcon. So what you mentioned there is something that, a lot of designers have mentioned, and I think you guys handle it in different ways. But you say, we just didn't think it'd be that strong, and then it was. So what kind of processes do you utilize to try to zero in on whether something's too strong or not strong enough? I know there's like external playtesting, and the degree to which that's successful can vary, like it's not an easy, like, well, this will solve all of our problems. So do you think it can be fully solved internally, or is there always going to be stuff that gets out to the public and you have to deal with externally?
I think with a card game, there's always going to be something that gets out. Like you're kind of deciding whether or not to push the envelope with card designs. And if you don't push the envelope with card designs, then the game is not going to be very interesting. Like if you can create an environment that either your internal team can solve, and sometimes the internal team, especially at Fantasy Flight, it's a couple of people at most, like that's really difficult to do, or an external team of volunteer playtesters can solve. Like if that's going to be doable, then like your game probably won't have a lot of depth to the card interactions and it'll be very straightforward. And so you kind of have to take some risks. You kind of have to take some chances in order to create something that is greater than maybe the sum of its parts and greater than what even you understand it to be. And inherently things are going to not always play out the way you expect. Things are going to break in some cases. And so I think one thing I did learn over the course of, working on a bunch of different games is like, you need to be proactive and you need to like address those things as quickly as possible, because the worst thing that you can do is just let those things fester and just be like, oh, it'll take care of itself, or it hasn't won a tournament yet. Like stop it before it wins a tournament. Don't wait till after it wins a tournament. I think that's always the best case scenario is, move quickly when you think something is going to break and try to make sure that you have processes in place to fix it, because things inevitably will break. And so like, I think the success of a good development team and a good development on a game is just things break less frequently. And like things don't break all the time. Like if things are breaking all the time, that's a problem. Something is wrong there. But if things are slipping through now and again, I think that's par for the course in a lot of ways.
So when you mention, the success of a design is effectively in how often things are breaking down like that. Are there specific things when you're thinking about design or working on a game that make that inherently easier? Like, is it just a skill set of experience and knowing what looks like it could be a problem? Or is there kind of a more fundamental approach and lessons that or principles that you're playing to that prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I think there are definitely principles. And I think like recursion is a great example of something where you should take maybe the resources you have devoted to testing or play testing or looking into stuff that deals with recursion and like double or triple it, because like you need to be really sure, when you
it's the
put
flashing
those sorts of
signals
things
you're
into the
talking
game.
about.
Exactly. So like over time, you do kind of develop a little bit of an intuition as far as like, that seems like it could be tricky. And, recursion isn't the only one. And I imagine some of the other sins that you talk about are also going to be those moments where you're like, maybe you should take a step back and think about it. Like resource acceleration is another just big category where you should probably take a step back and think about like, what is this doing in the game? What is this trying to do in the game? But recursion, I think, is an example of one of those places where it's like, when you do this, you just need to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more careful, and realize that the actual potential for a negative play experience is very, very high here. And so I kind of usually just group things into the bucket of a negative play experience. And I kind of define a negative play experience as like some player promise that is made either like implicitly or explicitly is being broken. And so those things that go into that bucket that kind of change the way that the game is played are the things that you really need to watch out for. And so, I do think like you can like do things to like prevent it from happening, but like over time, like as you work on a game, like you will get better at recognizing the parts of that particular game that are potentially going to be issues and potentially going to be problematic. Like I think another part of Star Wars Destiny is that the game itself isn't really built with a lot of kind of passive or static effects. And so it's like the actual, I suppose, risk of like infinite combos and kind of going infinite in that regard isn't really there in the same way that it is in other games. And that was another reason why we were a little bit more optimistic about the potential to recur some cards, is because we knew like it wouldn't really go infinite in the same way that it could in other games.
Yeah, for sure. So on that note, just kind of framing up recursion in general, you mentioned is one of those things that you have to watch out for. So we're dancing around it a little bit, but why do you think recursion leads to such a negative play experience?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first reason is that it can make the game incredibly repetitive. One of the things the recursion does is make the game play out repetitively. I don't know if I've mentioned it, but recursion is pretty repetitive.
And I like that. That was a long bet on that joke, but I'm really happy you went there.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like that is number one. Like number one is like doing the same thing over and over again is pretty boring. And usually in a card game, like, you have a limit to the number of cards that you can put in your deck. And so recursion is kind of breaking that limit. It's saying, oh, you thought you could have 2 or 3 or 4 cards? No, double it or triple it. Now you can have as many of these cards as you want. And so it creates a lot of pressure on, the other player to potentially be able to play around a card multiple times. And so by creating repetitive gameplay, you are basically removing a lot of counterplay. Like maybe I can deal with 2 copies of this card. Can I deal with 4, 6, or 8? Probably not. You're also putting a lot more pressure on all of the other cards in the game, because now that recursive card can turn into any of those other cards in the game. So I think an example from Netrunner is like Account Siphon or Parasite. Like, I think Account Siphon is a better example because Parasite is less powerful kind of in a vacuum and by itself. But like Account Siphon is a card where it's a bit of a power outlier and it's very strong at what it does. And it's kind of like the best way to attack the corp economically. And so without recursion, it's like, okay, you're going to be hit by a couple of these, like 3 up to 3 per game. You can probably have a plan for that. You can probably handle it. You add in some recursion, same old things, deja vu. Now you're dealing with 6 or 9 account siphons. It's like, how could you possibly deal with that economically? And so the power outlier of account siphon becomes the one thing that everybody is interested in recurring over and over and over again. And so anytime you have any power outlier in your game, by printing a recursive copy, you're basically adding in that many copies of that card to the deck. And so that's pretty much the main reason why recursion is pretty scary.
I mean, so do you have any rules then? Let's just say like recursion isn't off the table, right? Because as you said, you need texture, you need outlets, you need design space, as the kids say. Is there any rules then going into designing a recursion effect that, aside from the blinking red lights and the testing, that you can take with you? So I think of like, what if deja vu, should it have cost 4? Would that have solved the problem? Or should it have cost 5? Would that have solved the problem? Is it just that if your recursion effects are too easy is when it's an issue? Or is recursion as a whole just like, better be careful regardless of the cost?
I think, yes, it should be, in general, your first instinct should be, okay, regardless of the cost, be careful. But you can certainly pull any number of levers to make recursion a little bit more palatable. And I think obviously power is one, but I think power is not always necessarily enough. So I'll use an example for Magic. A couple of years ago, there was this card Nexus of Fate, which basically created an extra turn and then shuffled itself back into the deck. And it was costed at like 7 mana, which is like a lot more than a normal extra turn is, thinking that like, hey, the power level of this card is relatively low, so that in and of itself should prevent it from seeing a lot of play. But it wasn't so low that like people didn't play it. And so then they started looping and just creating a scenario where they're just trying to run their opponent out of cards They're not actually putting a win condition in their deck itself. And so it's like, yes, that card in a vacuum doesn't look very good, but because it allows you to create kind of infinite copies of itself, it almost doesn't matter what it costs, provided, you can get enough mana to play it. Like, the power level is almost irrelevant at a certain point in the game. And so like, cost is normally the lever that we use to say how powerful is this card. Like a 1 cost card, 2 cost card, 3 cost card, that's kind of the rate of the card. And so like, tweaking that knob can potentially make the card unplayable, but if it's unplayable, you shouldn't print it in the first place. And so you have to kind of find the middle ground where it's like, okay, is this card okay to print at this cost? If so, that's fine. But if the effect is still scary, I wouldn't print it. Like, I don't think cost is enough to not print the card. And so I think some rules that you can apply is you can say, my recursion card should be very narrow and niche, and you should make sure that like, hey, maybe you can only pick up one specific type of card from the graveyard. And now I can kind of do the check of like, okay, it can only get this type of card. Let's make sure that those types of cards are okay to get back. You can also make sure that it's not a multiple recursion card where like it gets multiple things. So for an example, in Star Wars Destiny, one of the other recursion cards that we created was like cheat or scavenge, where cheat actually goes and switches a card from your discard pile with a card in your hand. And so you're actually down a card. Like, you're not even card neutral at that point, you're like down a card. And so like, you're not going to be able to keep looping that over and over again if you're down a card, where scavenge basically like replaces it with itself. And so like, that's card neutral. You want to avoid the ones that are like card positive that potentially get back multiple things, because now you can not only get back multiple things, but you could get back another copy of the recursion card, and then you start going down really, really scary paths. So if you're making a recursive card, think about how to limit it, maybe as far as the targets that it can go for, and also try to make it card neutral or card negative versus card positive, because the card positive ones are where you really get into trouble in most cases.
That makes a lot of sense. And if it's card negative, then it kind of deals with itself.
Theoretically.
I mean, the rule set matters. Like Destiny, when you ran out of cards, right, you were like out of cards, and like that's a problem. It's not like you shuffle back up. You shuffle back up, then like just discarding and being card negative could also create a non-winnable scenario potentially. Do you have any examples in your experience as a player or a designer of card recursion that you were absolutely okay with? That was like totally, it was playable, but it also wasn't busted and creating all sorts of design problems?
I mean, I think there are definitely a lot of decent recursion cards that, I've designed over the years and didn't prove to be too powerful. I mean, I think, Steven, you brought up Deja Vu. I'm actually completely comfortable with Deja Vu. I think it's totally fine to keep recurring viruses and parasites and things of that sort in Netrunner. Like, I think I wouldn't still make that card positive because it was like return a card or 2 cards if they're viruses. I probably wouldn't make that like card positive now, but like viruses were kind of that niche target where it's like you can't really do a bunch of like completely busted stuff with only viruses. And so I think that is fine. I think going back to Netrunner again, Levy AR lab access just removed itself from the game. Like, just putting that as another tool, just remove itself from the game after using it. So you kind of basically break any loops before they start getting out of hand is something that's also completely fine. Magic uses that a lot. A lot of cards that have the potential to kind of go infinite will exile themselves. And so, yeah, I think like there can be fun things to do with recursion. I think, recursion as a way to like tutor from your discard pile is actually like pretty interesting in a lot of cases. And so I think there are good ways to do recursion, and I have, designed recursion for that reason. But again, just got to be careful. I do, though, want to follow up, Zach, on something you did mention, which was just kind of about like running out of cards and how different games handle that. I think if your game does use deck as a life total, like you have to be doubly concerned about recursion, because that is a way to infinitely extend the game as well. And that's where you get into a lot of problems when it's like the game is just not going to end. I don't need to put a proactive win condition in my deck. I'm just going to sit here, recur my deck, and make sure that you don't win. And that's where a lot of the feel bad experiences, kind of the hyperspace jump of like, I'm just going to sit here and do nothing. And then the turn kind of end up is in that stage where recursion basically becomes a win condition itself because the game cares about the number of cards in the deck.
So how then does your quite beautiful perspective on recursion, at least at this phase of your design career, how does that now inform your choices with spell slingers, for instance? Like, are there things you've baked into that game knowing that this mechanic is problematic?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of it. I'll say that. But again, not having a lot of it doesn't mean that you could potentially mess up, the one or two cards that do it. But I will say, like, working in digital, it's a little bit different because, like, if you look at Hearthstone and if you look at Spell Slingers, like, we don't really have a visible graveyard or a visible discard pile. And so, like, recursion looks a little bit different in games like that, where it's not like I'm searching through my entire graveyard or discard pile, pulling out a card, or, I'm not even necessarily targeting things in the same way. And so a lot of our cards are a little bit more like, they do like pull stuff out, but like they don't really give you choice. And so like it's like pull the strongest creature of your graveyard and add it to your hand. And so like it doesn't mean that, again, you can't abuse it, but it does mean that like it's going to be a lot harder for players to abuse it when you don't give them choice. And so we've kind of prevented players from actually choosing and going into the discard pile in order to pull out specific things that can only use whatever the individual card says they can use.
Can you? That is fascinating to me. So can you just tell us a little bit about the difference that you've encountered designing a physical card game versus a digital card game? Like, I imagine it has to be more liberating, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think it is both liberating and also more restrictive in some ways. So like there's definitely a beauty of just like being able to write anything on a card and not having to worry about rules enforcement, which you get with a tabletop game. Like if you can imagine it, if you can write it, like people can figure it out and play it. I mean, maybe your rules can't handle it, so you need to be a little bit careful there. But theoretically, like if you can imagine it and write it on the card, you're done. Like that's it. With a digital game, it's not quite that simple. Everything has to be turned into ones and zeros, and so you need to make sure that the engineers and the devs can actually go in and implement it. And so, like my team, we design the cards, but we're not the ones necessarily going in and implementing it. And so we have to make sure that what we're designing is implementable. And so on the one hand, you can kind of do more stuff with like random card generation. You can do more stuff with just random targets and stuff like that in digital. But on the other hand, you have to make sure that you're still working within the parameters of something that is easier to implement. Because like the Zephyrus card from Hearthstone, for example, where it's like wish for the perfect card. And they spent like 3 months going in and figuring out the AI that goes into getting the perfect card. Like that's a great example of a digital only mechanic. I can't sit at the table and be like, this card gives me the perfect card. What the heck does that mean? Like that doesn't work. But on the other hand, they spent 3 months like going in and actually implementing it and spending, human resources on making sure that card functioned versus just writing it and shipping it. And so it's always kind of a give and take between like, how hard is this card to implement and how cool is this card? And the cooler the card, like the more likely you are to raise the ceiling of how much time you're willing to put into it. But you're still working on deadlines, you're still working within certain parameters. And so it's both freeing and also restrictive at the same time.
Is there like maybe this is the romantic in me, but is there with a digital card game like a lack of that delivery of the proofs and like the product actually being physically in your hands and getting out into the world that you find like missing when you get done with a digital set and it just kind of distributes to your players and you don't have like the proof really of the blood, sweat, and tears you put into it?
There are definitely different rituals surrounding, I think, digital than paper. Like the distribution is one of them. Like it is a little bit different. Like just, being able to like send it out to players and then all of a sudden they're playing with the new content. You don't have like that step where the packs come into the office and you're like, oh man, they're shipping next week and we need to crack some open. And like, this is the first pallet. But I think like the excitement around releases is pretty much the same. Like there are going to be moments when like the community comes together and they're like, oh shit, new cards. This is really exciting. And then you can follow the player journey as they experience these things for the first time. So I don't think that's so much different. But I think building up to releasing the cards is very different because in paper you reach a point where it's pencils down and it's like these cards are done. They're going off to the printer. They're getting, printed. And even if you want to change something, like it's too late. And so at that point, you're kind of able to like just kind of have this cathartic moment of like, okay, it's done. I did the best I could. We'll see what happens from here. Hopefully there's no hyperspace jumps, but like if there is, like, I can't fix it now. With a digital game, there is no pencils down moment. It's always like, well, has it actually released yet? No. Okay, we could change it. Should we change it? Like it's continuous development all the way up to the very end. And so like you never quite get out of like the set and move on to the next set in the same way mentally that you do with a physical game. So it's different in that regard. I don't know if one is better or worse than the other because the ability to actually go in and like be like, oh shit, we screwed that up. Let's go in and fix it before it gets out there is also very nice. And I think players at this point expect pretty like major changes to digital cards in a way that they don't expect major changes to physical cards.
Yeah, it's kind of a major boon and bane, right? Because you can, even if you made a mistake and didn't catch it by the time players got it, you at least have the option to change it after the fact,
yeah.
Which you can do in a physical realm, but that's where you get into banned lists and restricted lists and point changes and balance of the force and whatever the mechanism is.
Way.
One question I wanted to pick up on before we continue down the various game design issues. You mentioned earlier wanted to keep the rules for Destiny very simple, and I love that picture you paint of like, because I started playing Pokemon, well, air quotes Pokemon. I started playing in air quotes when I was like 8 or 9, the card game, and really at first I was just collecting the cards. And we stumbled through some games, and I don't think I played it right till I was an adult, honestly. And even now, I'm not quite sure I'm playing it right. But the reason I mention that is you painted the picture of 2 kids. This could be their first card game in the simple rule set. Do you, as a designer, I've just been curious about this. You're the first designer I'm getting to ask. Do you think that you would enjoy what you do more, or you could produce more engaging or enjoyable experiences if you weren't having to worry about all these issues and all these balance things? Like if it's just the 2.9, when I was 9, you could have printed anything, recursion Falcon thing, and it's like maybe it happens, and when it does, it's like, oh my gosh, this is a Falcon, I couldn't win because you just kept hyperspacing around. I don't know. Do you ever think about that? Like it always seems like all this effort goes towards optimization and this perfectly balanced system, but it seems like most of the games aren't even being played in that kind of a format. That's just the ones we're talking about.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Like I think this is a challenge for a lot of people who get deep into card games. Like you kind of have to decide, how are you going to balance this game? How are you going to design this game? Who are you balancing it for? Who are you designing it for? And that's not always an easy question to answer. I think in card games, a lot of times it's kind of like a trickle down approach where you balance for the top level of play and make sure that that is balanced and hope that, kind of people pick up on it. And as you move down, you could say the ladder of experience and or skill, that the game still remains, relatively balanced and playable. But that's not always the case because sometimes, cards have very strong uses in one or two particular cases that you have to, adjust for at the top level that, maybe somebody picking up the game for the first time will never even think of or never even experience. And so I do think like a lot of card games do tend to be balanced toward tournament play, toward the most competitive players. And that does affect the cards that you design, and it does affect the actual, end result of what gets printed or what gets released digitally. And I don't know if the games would necessarily be better if you like didn't take that into account, because like one reason that I love card games, that a lot of people like card games, that you guys like card games, is that like they are so deep and rewarding, and like you can keep going deeper and deeper and peeling back layers of the good games and continually getting better. The skill like ceiling is so high that it's like just very rewarding to kind of go down that path. And so if you don't take some of that into account, it may not necessarily be a lifestyle game in the way that a lot of card games are a lifestyle game. But I do think that if you wanted to just, design a fun Munchkin-esque card game where you're a little bit less worried about balance, like you could come up with a lot of crazy stuff that would probably be a better experience for the person who is just putting it on the table for the very first time. But then you have to ask, like, if they had a good time with that, are they going to have as good of a time when they put it on the table the second time and the third time and the fifth time? Like, at what point do they start realizing that, like, oh, I don't know, I wish that card wasn't so powerful because I keep losing to it. And so I think like it's something that you have to balance between top-down design, thematic design, trying to make the thing feel like whatever it is you're trying to represent in the coolest way possible, and also the bottom up of what does the game need to function as a game and as a game of skill. And I think most of the time, at least on the games I've worked on, we have leaned a little bit more toward making the game a game of skill. But you certainly could lean in the other direction and try to just make the game, I guess you could say, crazy. But like, good designers do both.
Or thematic, or leaning into like the hyperspace thing to me is so thematic. It's like, well, of course the Empire couldn't catch you. You were in the Falcon and you just kept jumping around.
You've seen the movies, right?
Yeah.
Lukas, you've just done such a stellar holistic job of addressing the topic of recursion that I want to hit you with a lightning round of the other mechanics that we're talking through. However, before we do that, I know that we have a lot of listeners that think of you quite fondly from the Netrunner and Star Wars Destiny days, or some of them maybe not so much, but most of us very much. Would you mind just giving us an update of how things have been going for you, like since you left FFG? You kind of left and we knew you were going to WotC and we didn't quite know what that entailed or what kind of work you'd be doing or like how fulfilling that would be. So yeah, I think people would just be curious kind of where did you end up and how did it go?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely felt like I wanted to kind of get experience in the digital space. And that was one of the primary reasons that I left Fantasy Flight, which I loved. And I'm not going to lie, like choosing to leave Fantasy Flight was probably one of, if not the hardest decisions of my life, because I really thought like I would be there until I retired, be there forever at a certain point. But I kind of just like, looked in the mirror and was like, what else can I do to challenge myself here? What else can I learn? I've learned the recursion lesson like 3 times already. So what else can I learn here? And I was kind of struggling to come up with something. And, Hearthstone back then was just a couple of years old. It was still pretty new. And I was playing that a lot. And I was really excited about the possibility of card games in a digital space. And like, it was a little bit more of an unexplored territory, terra incognita. And so when the opportunity came to move to WotC to work on a digital card game, I really decided I just couldn't turn it down. And, here I am a couple of years later. I wish I could say, everybody go download it. I can't because it's not out everywhere yet. And so like I am getting the full digital experience. Like things are not always under your control. Things take a lot longer to actually do, especially when you have a very high quality bar and you're looking to publish something that is incredibly polished. Like there's a lot of work that goes into it. There's a lot more people that have to touch the game in order to make it successful and get it out in front of players. And so I feel like I am learning a ton in that regard. And also, you know, I'm Magic adjacent. We all sit next to the Magic designers, and so a lot of people on my team, including myself, will work on Magic sets for a couple of months of the year. And so we still get to kind of dabble in that tabletop experience and the tabletop games that kind of first drew me into the hobby. And so overall, like it's fantastic. WotC is a great company. Really love it here. And I feel like, you know, I made the right choice, but like I have nothing but love and respect for Fantasy Flight Games and everything that they did, not only for me, but for, you know, players, and resurrecting Netrunner, resurrecting, you know, L5R. A lot of these games now, Star Wars Destiny, like rest in peace, all these games. Like I miss them. I miss them dearly. They're really close to my heart. And I hope, you know, this is not the last we've heard of most of them.
Yeah, wonderful, man. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. We appreciate just kind of getting an idea of where you are. So let's do the lightning round real quick. We're going to get you 6 mechanics. Of course, recursion was the 7th for you. And just a quick blurb that comes to your mind whenever you hear these mechanics, and any quick advice or quick thing you might want to say about them. We're going to start with denial, which is typically prevention, cancels, those kinds of things. What do you think when you think of denial?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be pretty careful with that. So I'm not surprised it made your list. Like, I think the main problem with denial is just you're preventing your opponent from doing something that they're trying to do that maybe they built their deck to do. And so if you put too much of it in the game, then it feels like you're not really playing the game. And I think that's true probably about, I'm guessing, so these other mechanics that are going to pop up on the list. It's like you want to create a scenario where both players feel like they're meaningfully interacting. And so if you prevent somebody from playing a bunch of their cards, the interaction feels more one-sided. I think denial is good in small quantities, but when you start being able to put your whole deck chock full of it, that's when you get into trouble.
All right, moving on to something that's near and dear to your team over there, resource cards, which is the idea that your resources are in your draw deck. I know that in both Netrunner and Destiny, you kind of had a mixed bag on that front. What do you think about resource cards in modern games?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, you go back to the grandfather of all collectible card games, Magic the Gathering, which, you know, is honestly like doing great. And a lot of people, when they went to make card games, decided that they didn't like the mana screw or mana flood opportunities in Magic, and so they're like, we're going to change this. And I mean, Magic is still standing. A lot of those games are not standing, and so I think with resources in the deck, like you really have to decide, you know, where do you want your randomness to come from? Like, do you want your randomness to come from the resource system? Do you want your randomness to come from somewhere else? Because all games have randomness and all card games have randomness in them. The deck shuffle is a big one, but if you don't have it there, you're going to have it somewhere else. And so I think it's a choice that a lot of games, you know, decide to kind of hedge against, like the extremes. And I think like even modern Magic design, you'll look at it and like we have a lot of mechanics, you know, like cycling and land search and stuff that kind of hedge against some of the extreme outcomes. So like I think if you do that, like you just have to have some safeguards built into your system or the cards to prevent it from getting maybe a little bit too random. But it really adds a ton to the replayability of the game if you don't have a reliable resource curve. So it kind of depends on what you're going for.
Right on. Next up, we have silver bullets. And this is, of course, seeding cards in a card pool that answer a very specific, very niche interaction or powerful card.
Yeah, I dislike silver bullets unless you're doing like best of 3 with sideboards. I think it works very well in games with sideboards. I think it doesn't work so well in games without sideboards. So I would say do not rely on silver bullets to balance your game, and do not point to a silver bullet and say, oh, this other strategy is fine because this card nukes it. It doesn't work that way.
All right, next up we have kind of a slam dunkaroo here, but the concept of free. So anytime a card has its cost reduced,
He
or
laughs.
otherwise is circumventing the printed cost. What do you think about that?
I mean, if recursion was like red flashing lights, I mean, I don't know. This is, throw some confetti, air horns, like blow that out. Like,
Can you imagine if you had a permanent card on the board that could recur something for free?
That would be crazy.
Yeah, just play the thing from discard for free over and over. Weird.
that's actually a good idea. I might go make that card now. Yeah,
I'm gonna have to steal that one.
That's really good. I think players will
You
have
call
a
it
lot of fun
the like Century Eagle, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say be very careful. Like the difference between 0 and 1 is so much larger than the difference between 1 and 2. It's not even close.
100%. Next up, second to last, we have LimitOne as a balancing mechanic. So we saw this in the Shards and Netrunner, which I don't think it was so much a balance there. It was more of a theme thing. But a lot of times you'll find these Limit 1 per deck on cards that are very strong. How do you feel about that kind of a mechanic?
Yeah, I would say that it just adds to the randomness of the deck shuffle. So like you're just adding more RNG to the game. Like if these cards are more powerful but show up less frequently, the games where they show up, you just have a much bigger advantage than the games when they don't show up. And so I don't think it's great as a mechanism to balance the cards. I think it can be used in order to keep the number of types of effects low, but I wouldn't make a card more powerful in most cases because there's only one in the deck. I think there are some cases where you can have a slightly higher power band for like a set of cards if that's baked into the game. So for example, in Spell Slingers, like legendary creatures, kind of like Hearthstone has creatures like the unique characters, you can only have one in your deck instead of two. And so the way we handle that is we give them a little bit more power, just slightly more power, but not so much that it's like, oh, I drew this card, game over. Just a little bit more to make up for the fact that they are a little bit less consistent. So careful, don't use it as a way to boost the power of those cards drastically. You can only boost them by a very small amount.
All right, and then finally, the mechanic or the concept of memory in a game, and this is particularly where it becomes taxed. So these are things like giant board states, infinite like static effects that could live on the board and buff a bunch of
plus
things.
Plus 1 to all your characters.
Plus 1 to this, plus 1 to that. Like, you probably had a lot of exposure to Game of Thrones. I feel like Game of Thrones had a lot of situations for me where there was 18 things on the board, and it was very hard to make sense of what the right move was. Good or bad in a game, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think memory is generally bad. Like having really complicated board states just potentially leads to analysis paralysis and makes it hard to actually make a good decision, and a decision that is, going to teach you something about the game when there are like 10 or 12 different card effects, that those 10 or 12 different card effects may never appear in the same way. And so like you're not necessarily learning a lot about the game if you forgot one or two of them. Like you weren't even aware of them when you made your decision. And so like, you don't even know what you would have made from a decision making standpoint if you had remembered them. And so you learned absolutely nothing, and now you're just frustrated. So yeah, I think those are very, very scary if you have like a bunch of passive or static effects that are all going off at the same time. I think in pretty much every game that I've worked on, we always try to make sure that there's not too much cognitive load on the player at any given time, and that there's not too many places to look for active effects that you might miss, because missing those is a real feel bad moment.
Well, Lukas, it has been an absolute joy to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do it. We really appreciate it, and we hope we can talk to you more in the future, and maybe even come out and see us sometime.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, feel free anytime. And we'll just finish things off here. Feel free to shout out anything that's going on for you, anything you would like players or listeners to know that you're up to, that you're doing, or that you want them to check out.
I guess I will say, if you're in one of those countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, check out Spell Slingers. You can find it in the Google Play Store. You can also find it in the iOS App Store, and then you can see a little bit about what I've been up to. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you to both of you. Like, Team Covenant has been such an amazing force for promoting the types of games that I love to play. And so I hope you guys keep going and never stop.
Hey,
awesome, Lukas. Thank you.
So good to see you. Really appreciate you saying that. And I do genuinely mean it. If you need anything, let us know. We're always happy to help. And, just for people that might be curious, myself included, any idea of a loose timeline and when people in, the United States might be able to check out your game? I'm just excited to know that's what you've been working on. You had to be a little secretive up front.
Yeah. I don't really have a loose timeline. I thought I had in the past, and I was wrong. So now
sounds like
my stance is no timelines.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I do look forward to checking out that game. We wish you nothing but the best, and I'm sure we'll have you back on at some point.
Thank you. Yeah, come out to Seattle sometime. I'd love to see you guys.